The second hand on the clock above the boiler room door had been ticking for 3 weeks. Every morning I'd watch it hit the 47-second mark and just hesitate. Not stop, not break. Just hesitate, like it was deciding something. Then it would jerk forward and keep going. I'm not sure why I'm starting there, but when I try to go back to that period of my life, that's the image that comes first. Not the hospital ceiling, not the faces leaning over me, not the sound of the machine that was doing my breathing while I wasn't. The clock, the hesitation at 47, the decision to keep going. My name is David Farrell. I was the building maintenance supervisor at a mid-sized hospital in northern Italy for 11 years. I was the man you called when a pipe sweated through the ceiling tiles, or when the autoclave and sterilization started throwing error codes at 2 a.m. I fixed things. That was the whole of it. I was 41 years old when I died. Clinically, technically, medically, cardiac arrest in the basement corridor of the very building I'd maintained for a decade. 28 minutes without a pulse. I'm not telling this because it's inspiring. I'm telling it because of a boy I barely knew. A boy I met once in a hallway, who said something to me that I dismissed entirely, and who I only understood, if I understand him at all, years after he was already gone. I'm still not sure what I believe about any of it, but I keep thinking about that clock, and I keep thinking about him. Let me tell you what kind of man I was. Not the kind that shows up in stories like this. I wasn't broken in any dramatic way, not drinking myself to sleep, not haunted by some childhood wound. I was just reduced. I'd become a smaller version of whatever I was supposed to be, and I'd done it so gradually I hadn't noticed until the reduction was basically complete. The job was fine. There's a specific satisfaction in keeping a building alive, and a hospital is alive in ways other buildings aren't. The systems are interdependent. The stakes are real. If the HVAC in the ICU goes wrong at 3 a.m, people on ventilators feel it. I understood that weight. I respected it. What I didn't have, what I had quietly stopped having somewhere around year 6 or 7, was anything resembling a life outside of it. Elena had left by then. The divorce wasn't ugly. That almost made it worse. There was just Elena sitting across from me at our kitchen table one Sunday morning, both hands wrapped around a coffee cup, saying, "David, I don't think you're here anymore. I don't mean physically." I told her I didn't know what that meant. She said, "I know." And that was more or less that. Marta came on alternating weekends. She was a serious kid, quiet, observant, the kind of child who notices things adults edit out. She'd sit on the metal workbench in the boiler room doing her homework while I replaced a valve, feet dangling, pencil moving, occasionally looking up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I told myself she was fine. I told myself that a lot. I was raised loosely Catholic, baptized, confirmed, fundamentally indifferent. By the time I was working at the hospital, I'd drifted considerably further from one end than the other. Not bitterness, more like disinterest. The chaplains on the palliative ward were, without exception, good people, genuinely present with dying patients in a way I found humanly admirable and metaphysically irrelevant. I was polite about it. I just didn't think about it. What I thought about was pressure differentials, load-bearing tolerances, practical things, measurable things, things that had a right answer if you looked carefully enough. I was, in retrospect, a man who had outsourced his entire inner life to the physical logic of broken systems. It felt like enough. Most of the time, it felt like more than enough. In the 18 months before everything happened, I started having trouble sleeping. I'd wake at 3 or 4, mind already running, turning over work problems that didn't actually require that much attention. I'd enumerate them in the dark like an inventory, then either drift off or give up and sit at the kitchen table until it was acceptable to go in. My GP mentioned stress. He also mentioned my heart, a slightly irregular reading on a routine ECG. Probably nothing. He referred me to a cardiologist with a 3-month waiting list, and I scheduled the appointment and allowed it to drift to the back of my attention the way you allow things to drift when they don't feel urgent. The appointment was 14 days after I died. I need to be precise about this because I've replayed it enough times that I'm aware of how memory works, how it fills in gaps, smooths edges, retroactively assigns meaning to things that felt like nothing at the time. I don't want to do that. I want to tell you what actually happened as plainly as I can. It was a Tuesday. I'd been dealing with the elevator in the East Wing since Monday afternoon, an E14 fault code, door sensor misalignment, the fourth sensor requiring a tool I'd had to order. The tool had arrived that morning. I was carrying it down the corridor, already mentally inside the repair, already past everything around me. There was a boy standing in front of the bulletin board at the far end, maybe 14, 15. Slight build, dark hair, regular clothes, a backpack on one shoulder. He was reading the staff notice board, shift schedules, union updates, and evacuation diagrams 6 years out of date. Nothing that would interest a teenager, but he wasn't skimming. He was actually reading, present with it, the way you'd look at something worth looking at. I stopped. "This area is for staff," I said. He turned and looked at me, not startled. No flinch, no reorientation. He just turned as if he'd been expecting someone to say exactly that. "Sorry, I got turned around. I was visiting someone on the second floor." I told him the way back. He said he knew. He'd been here before. There was a pause. I should have moved on. The elevator was waiting. "Who are you visiting?" I asked. I don't know why. He said an older woman's name. She'd had a procedure the day before. He'd wanted to check on her. "Family?" He considered this a moment too long for the question. "Not exactly. She lives in my building. She doesn't have anyone who comes." 14 or 15 years old on a Tuesday, visiting an elderly neighbor with no family. "Shouldn't you be in school?" He smiled, not defensively, more like he found the question genuinely reasonable. Half day. I had already half-turned, already back inside the E14 vault, the sensor panel, and he said, "Are you all right?" I stopped. It turned back. "You look tired." Not with pity, more like an observation worth sharing, the way you'd tell someone they had paint on their sleeve. "I'm fine," I said. He nodded, adjusted the strap of his backpack, and said, "Okay, sorry for being in the wrong place." And he walked past me back towards the junction and turned left. I stood there for maybe 5 seconds. Then I went and fixed the elevator. I thought about the interaction once, briefly, that evening. The directness of the question, the uncomfortable feeling of someone seeing through the thing you're performing. And then I filed it away under nothing significant and moved on. I didn't know his name. I didn't find out his name until nearly 2 years after he died, and when I did, lying in a rehabilitation bed, typing what little I remembered into a search engine, following threads until they led somewhere I wasn't expecting. I sat with the screen for a long time, just sat. The elevator worked fine after that, clean repair. 40 minutes, one replaced sensor, no more E14. I logged it, filed the work order as completed, and moved on to the next thing on the list. That's what that period of my life looked like from the inside. A list, an ongoing, self-replenishing list of things that needed attention, things that had been attended to, and things that were waiting. The list was never finished. That was the nature of it. A building is a system in constant slow deterioration. You're not fixing it toward completion, you're just managing the rate of decline. Keeping it functional, keeping it safe. The work doesn't end because the entropy doesn't end. I found that comforting, if I'm honest. A list with no end is also a list that never runs out of reasons to keep going. Autumn came. The hospital heating system required its seasonal calibration, a 2-week process involving 11 separate zones, 3 legacy thermostatic controllers that predated the current building management software and refused to communicate with it, and a recurring pressure problem in the northwest wing that I'd been documenting for 4 years without receiving authorization to actually fix. I wrote the same recommendation in the same quarterly report. Facilities management acknowledged it with the same language. Nothing changed. The pipes in the northwest wing knocked every morning between 6 and 8 as the system came up to temperature, and the nurses on that floor had stopped mentioning it because they'd accepted it as architecture. I hadn't accepted it, but I'd learned to store that particular frustration in a compartment I didn't open very often. Marta came for her October weekend. She was 9 by then. No, 10. She'd had a birthday in September that I'd attended at Elena's mother's apartment, standing slightly outside the circle of it, holding a gift I'd asked Elena to help me choose. Marta had thanked me with a hug that lasted exactly as long as it needed to and no longer. She was becoming someone. I could feel it happening, and I couldn't quite locate my place in the process. That October weekend, she came and we went to the Saturday market, and I bought her a book she'd pointed at and a pastry she didn't finish, and we walked back in the kind of silence that can mean anything. In the evening, she sat at my kitchen table doing something on her tablet, and I was reading a maintenance manual for a new sterilization unit we were installing in March. And at some point, she looked up and said, "Papa, do you like your job?" I looked up. "What kind of question is that?" "A normal one," she said. I thought about it. Genuinely, for a moment, thought about it. "I'm good at it," I said. She looked at me with that expression again, the one I couldn't read. Then she looked back at her tablet. I told myself that was a fine answer. The sleeplessness got worse in November, not dramatically. The pattern just shifted, where before I wake once and lie still for an hour, I started waking twice, sometimes 3 times. I checked the time with the specific dread of someone hoping it's later than it is, and it was always earlier than I wanted. 2:14, 3:40, the red numbers on the bedside clock in the dark. I started noticing clocks more generally. The wall clock in the boiler room with its hesitating second hands. The large analog clock in the main lobby that ran 40 seconds fast, and that I'd corrected 17 times over the years before accepting that something in its mechanism wanted to run fast and wasn't going to stop. The clock in the stab break room whose battery died every 3 months with a reliability that seemed almost intentional. I don't know when I started finding clocks unsettling. It happened incrementally, the way most things that matter happen, below the threshold of notice until suddenly they're all you can see. December. The cardiologist appointment I'd been referred to was now 6 weeks away. I hadn't thought about it much. My heart felt fine, or what I interpreted as fine, which was the absence of obvious symptoms, which is not the same thing at all, but which I was treating as equivalent. There was an incident on a Wednesday evening that I didn't report and that I've thought about many times since. I was in the sub-basement access corridor, not the sealed level, but the utility corridor above it, which housed the main electrical distribution panels and the building's primary water main shutoff. I was down there because one of the distribution panels had been throwing a ground fault warning, intermittent, not critical, but worth checking. I'd been down there maybe 20 minutes when I had what I described to myself at the time as dizziness. It wasn't dizziness, I know that now. I didn't know it then, or I knew it and decided not to know it, which is different. It was maybe 15 seconds. A pressure in the center of my chest, not sharp, more like something being compressed from the outside. A brief dimming at the edges of my vision. A feeling, and this is the part I find hardest to describe without it sounding more significant than I was willing to let it be. A feeling of sudden distance from everything around me. The panels, the pipes, the fluorescent lights. As if I had stepped back several feet from my own body without actually moving. Then it passed. I stood still for a moment, put my hand against the wall, took several breaths. The panel was fine. A loose ground wire I tightened in 4 minutes. I went back upstairs, finished my shift, drove home. I didn't write it down, didn't call the cardiologist's office to move the appointment forward, didn't mention it to anyone. I made a note in my head to drink more water and get more sleep. Christmas was Elena's year. Marta called me on Christmas morning and we talked for 22 minutes about her gift from her grandmother, about a film she'd seen with her school, about whether the snow they'd had in Turin was more or less than the snow we'd had here. Ordinary things. The kind of conversation that is also, beneath its surface, a different conversation entirely. 2 people checking on the structural integrity of something without naming the structure. When we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a while. The apartment was quiet, in the way apartments are quiet on Christmas when you're alone in them. I made coffee. I read. I went into the hospital for 3 hours in the afternoon because the chiller unit on the roof had been showing temperature variance and I wanted to check the refrigerant levels before the holiday shut down. The roof was cold. The city below was doing what cities do on Christmas. Contracted into itself, lights and windows, distant sound of bells from somewhere. I stood up there for longer than the task required. I don't know what I was waiting for. I don't think I was waiting for anything. I think I was just there, present in the way that doesn't cost anything and doesn't produce anything, and sometimes if you let it, is almost enough. January was administrative. February, I had a chest cold that lasted 3 weeks, and that I worked through because there was nobody else who knew the heating system well enough to manage the calibration checks, and because stopping felt harder than continuing. The cardiologist appointment was now 4 weeks away. 3. 2. I was tired in a way that had stopped feeling like tiredness and started feeling like weather, a condition of the atmosphere rather than a state I'd entered and could leave. Marta's February visit, she arrived on a Friday evening, and by Saturday morning I could tell something was different. She was quieter than usual, which for Marta was a specific quality of quiet. Loaded. We walked to the market again, because that's what we did, and at the falafel stand near the entrance, she stopped and looked at me. "Are you sleeping?" she said. 10 years old. Asking her father if he was sleeping. "Well enough," I said. She took her falafel, and we walked. Later, after dinner, she was brushing her teeth, and I was in the hallway outside the bathroom, and she said, around the toothbrush, "Papa, you should see a doctor." "I have an appointment," I said. "Soon?" 2 weeks. She spat, rinsed, looked at me in the mirror. "Okay," she said. "Just okay." But the way she said it, the weight she put in it without raising her voice, I've thought about that a lot since. My 10-year-old daughter reading the room better than I was. The appointment was in the second week of March. I didn't make it. I've been asked to describe it several times. The cardiologist asked, in the careful clinical way cardiologists ask things, building a timeline from observable data points. The therapist asked differently, slower, with more space around the questions, interested in texture rather than sequence. My daughter asked once, years later when she was old enough to want the real version, and I tried to give it to her and found that the real version has gaps in it that I can't fill, and that the gaps are not incidental. They're structural. They're part of what it is. So let me tell you what I actually have. It was a Thursday, the 4th of March. I know the date with a precision I don't have for most dates because it became afterward a date that other people referenced in my presence. Doctors, paperwork, the woman from HR who called Elena because Elena was still listed as my emergency contact and nobody had updated that. The 4th of March, a Thursday. I had been at work since 7:15. The morning was ordinary to a degree that I find almost offensive in retrospect. Ordinary in the complete undecorated way of mornings that have no idea what they're the morning of. I'd had coffee, the bad coffee from the break room machine, not the good coffee from the place near the hospital entrance because I'd come in through the service entrance and hadn't wanted to walk around. I'd checked the overnight fault log. 2 minor alerts, both self-resolved. I'd spoken briefly with Tommaso, one of the evening maintenance staff coming off his shift, about a vibration he'd noticed in the pump room. He was tired and going home. We talked for maybe 4 minutes. That was the last conversation I had before everything changed. I want to be careful here. I want to resist the pull toward meaning that the mind applies to last ordinary moments, the instinct to find in them some quality of light, some subtle difference in texture that foreshadowed what was coming. I don't think there was any. Tommaso was tired. The coffee was bad. The fault log was routine. The morning had no idea. I was in the basement corridor at approximately 10:40. I know this from the security camera timestamp. I've been told this. I haven't seen the footage and don't want to. I was walking from the electrical distribution room toward the east stairwell. I had a clipboard. There was a scheduled inspection of the fire suppression system components in the ground floor ceiling space, which required accessing a junction box above a panel near the stairwell base. Routine. Something I'd done a version of probably 60 times. What I remember from that walk, the smell of the corridor, that specific hospital basement smell, cold concrete, trace disinfectants, the faint metallic note that comes from the water in the pipes, something almost ozone-like in the recycled air. I've smelled it since, during subsequent visits to that building in the years after, and it does something to me that I don't have a clean word for. Not fear exactly. More like the feeling of standing at the edge of something without being able to see how deep it goes. The fluorescent light at the far end of the corridor was flickering, not rapidly, just a slow, irregular pulse like a heartbeat that was losing confidence. I made a mental note to replace it. I remember thinking about Marta, not with any particular focus. She just surfaced in my mind the way thoughts do when you're doing something physical and routine that doesn't require your full attention. Her face at the bathroom mirror the weekend before. Okay, the weight she put in that word. I remember the junction box coming into view. I remember putting my hand out toward the panel access latch. And then, nothing, not darkness. Nothing is different from darkness. Darkness is a thing, a presence. An absence of light that still occupies space. What I entered was not that. It was more like an edit, a cut, the film running and then the film not running, and no perceptible moment between those two states. I was reaching for the latch, and then I was somewhere else entirely. I'm going to tell you what I experienced during those 28 minutes, and I'm going to ask you to hold it carefully. Because I have held it carefully for years, and I still don't know what to do with it. I am not a person who has visions. I am not a person who reports mystical experiences. I'm a person who fixes pipes and calibrates sensors and reads fault codes. I want that on the record before I continue. What I experienced did not feel like a dream. I've had thousands of dreams. I know the texture of them, the way logic bends, the way faces become composites, the way settings shift without transition and you accept the shift because you're inside it. This had none of those qualities. It had instead a quality of... I keep returning to the word lateral, as if I had stepped sideways out of the dimension where time moves forward and was standing somewhere adjacent to it. There was no tunnel, no light, no deceased relatives extending their hands toward me. There was a room, not a room I recognized, not a room that matched any architectural memory I had. It was spare. White walls that weren't quite white, more the color of winter light on snow. A floor, a ceiling. No obvious source of illumination. The light was simply present, without origin. No windows, no doors, or none that I could see. And in the room there was a chair, wooden, simple. And on the chair, facing slightly away from me, someone was sitting. I couldn't see their face. I want to be honest about that. I have never seen their face, not in the original experience and not in any of the subsequent times I've returned to it in my mind, and I'm aware of how frustrating that is narratively. The face was simply not available to me, not obscured, just outside the range of what I was permitted to perceive. What I could tell, small, young. A teenager maybe, or someone who read as young without being definitively so. Dark hair, a stillness about them that was not the stillness of sleep or unconsciousness. It was the stillness of someone who is completely attentively present, who is waiting, but not impatiently, who has decided that waiting is not a diminishment. They didn't speak. I didn't speak. At some point, I have no sense of duration, no way to map the 28 minutes onto what I experienced. They turned their heads slightly, not toward me, just a slight adjustment. The way you'd turn your head if you heard something in the next room. A reorientation of attention. And I felt, this is the part that is hardest to transmit. Hardest to say without it sounding like exactly the kind of thing I just told you I wasn't going to say. I felt accounted for, not saved, not loved, not in the way the word is usually used. Not reassured, accounted for. Like a number that had been verified. Like something that had been checked against a list and found to be present. It sounds cold when I describe it that way. It wasn't cold. It was... I don't have the right equipment for this, linguistically. I've spent years looking for the right word, and I don't have it. The closest I can get is, it felt like being known by something that had no reason to know you and knew you anyway. Completely. Without judgment and without particular warmth, in the way that truth is without particular warmth. It just is. It just was. And then the room was gone. What replaced it was pain. Not abstract pain, specific, immediate, physical pain of a type I had never experienced and hoped to never experience again. The pain of a chest that has been worked on. The pain of ribs that have been compressed repeatedly by hands trying to restart something that had stopped. The pain of returning. I later learned that I had been found by an orderly named Renato, who had been cutting through the basement corridor on his way to the loading dock, which was not his usual route, but which he had taken that day because there was a delivery he wanted to sign for personally. He'd found me on the floor, called the code, begun compressions. The crash team had arrived within 4 minutes. 28 minutes. I'm told that the outcomes for cardiac arrests of that duration are not good, statistically. I'm told that the brain begins to sustain damage within 4 to 6 minutes without oxygenated blood, and that 28 minutes without a pulse is a number that appears more often in mortality statistics than in recovery narratives. I'm told that the cardiologist who worked on me that day used the word remarkable in her notes. I don't feel remarkable. I felt, when I returned, furious. That surprised everyone, including me. Not confused, not frightened, not grateful, furious. A cold, specific, sourceless anger that had no clear object, and that I couldn't explain to the people around me, and that sat in my chest, next to the place they'd been pressing, next to the place that had stopped and started again, like something that had moved in while the apartment was empty and wasn't planning to leave. A nurse asked me if I was in pain. I said yes. She asked where. I said everywhere. She adjusted something and the pain became more manageable and the anger did not. The cardiologist came and spoke to me. She was careful and precise and kind. She explained what had happened in the language of mechanisms, the specific electrical failure in my cardiac conduction system, the way the arrest had propagated, the intervention, the outcome. She spoke about the next steps, a device, monitoring, medication, follow-up. She asked if I had questions. I stared at the ceiling. The ceiling of the recovery bay was standard hospital ceiling. Acoustic tile, recessed lighting, a small smoke detector. I examined it with the professional attention of a man who had spent 11 years knowing what was above hospital ceilings. The smoke detector in this bay needs recalibrating, I said. The sensitivity is set for a larger room. You'll get false positives. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very gently, Mr. Farrell, is there someone we can call? I thought about Marta. Not yet, I said. They called Elena. Elena came. She sat beside the bed for a long time without saying anything, which was, I don't know what it was. It was something. She looked at me the way you look at an object you thought you'd lost and then found and aren't quite sure yet what you feel about having it back. She didn't cry. I was glad she didn't cry. At some point, she put her hand over mine on the bed rail. Just placed it there, didn't squeeze, didn't speak. We stayed like that for a while. Outside the window, I had a window. I'd been moved by then to a regular room. The sky was doing the thing March skies do in the late afternoon, going gray and gold at the same time, the light coming in at a low angle that made the room feel provisional. I watched the sky. I thought about the room, the chair, the figure with dark hair and that impossible stillness. I didn't tell Elena about it. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not yet. They kept me for 9 days. 9 days is a long time when you have nothing to do but be a body that is being monitored. Vitals every 4 hours. The defibrillator implant surgery on day 3. A small device, a surprisingly small device for something that now had veto power over whether I lived or died. And then the recovery from that layered on top of the recovery from everything else. A specific kind of stillness was required of me that I didn't have the temperament for and had to perform anyway. I read. I stared at the ceiling. I watched the smoke detector I'd mentioned to the cardiologist and noted with grim satisfaction that it triggered a false alarm on day 5. A nurse silenced it and looked mildly annoyed and didn't connect it to anything. Elena came every day for the first 4 days, then every other day. She brought things, fruit I didn't eat, a crossword magazine I didn't open, once a small plant in a terracotta pot that sat on the windowsill and that I found myself looking at more than I expected. It was alive in the simple, declarative way that plants are alive. No commentary, no expectations, just continuing. Marta didn't come to the hospital. Elena and I agreed on that, briefly on the phone without much discussion. She was 10. The ward wasn't the right place. I would see her when I was home. I told myself that was the right call. I'm still not entirely sure. The anger didn't leave. I want to be clear that it wasn't anger at anything I could name. Not at my heart for failing. Not at the cardiologist appointment I delayed. Not at Elena. Not at the divorce. Not at the accumulated choices that had left me alone in a basement corridor with nobody nearby except an orderly who happened to take the wrong route that morning. It was more interior than that, more structural. Like the anger wasn't an emotion so much as a new load-bearing element, something that had moved into the architecture of me and was now holding something up. and I didn't know what would happen to the rest of the structure if I removed it. The therapist they referred me to, court-appointed. I mentioned that earlier. I'll explain that in a moment. She had a theory about this. She used the phrase re-entry hostility, which she explained was not uncommon in people who had experienced clinical death and resuscitation. The body returns to life and some part of the psyche resists the return. Objects, a kind of protest. I asked her what it was protesting. She said that was the interesting question. I didn't find it interesting. I found it exhausting. The court-appointed detail. I should explain. On day 11 after discharge, I was home by then, signed off for 6 weeks of medical leave, rattling around the apartment with too many hours and not enough architecture to fill them. I drove to the hospital. Not as a patient, I just drove there. Parked in the staff lot out of habit. Sat in the car for a while. Then got out, went in through the service entrance. Walked to the basement corridor. I stood in the place where I'd fallen. The floor was clean. Of course it was. There was nothing there. No mark, no indication that anything had happened. The fluorescent light at the far end had been replaced. It burned steadily, no flicker. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes. Then I went to the electrical distribution room and started checking the panels. I was there for 2 hours before anyone noticed. The facilities manager, a man named Giorgio, who had been my indirect supervisor for 3 years and who I respected without warmth, found me and was visibly alarmed and called Elena, who drove 40 minutes to collect me. And the combination of Elena's alarm and Giorgio's report to HR resulted in a mandatory psychiatric evaluation and several weeks of supervised recovery that included the therapist. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't in crisis, not in the way they feared. I just didn't know what else to do with myself. The building needed maintaining. The panels needed checking. I knew how to do those things. The therapist's name was Dr. Sanna. She was Sardinian, which meant she had a particular quality of patience. Not the performed patience of therapeutic training, but something more geological. She waited in a way that felt like landscape. In our third session, she asked me about the 28 minutes. I hadn't mentioned them, not to her, not to anyone. I looked at her for a moment. There's nothing to tell, I said. She didn't push it. She made a small neutral sound and asked about something else entirely, and I felt, for reasons I couldn't explain, mildly furious. I started sleeping better around week 4. Not well, better. The 3 a.m. wakings became 1. The 1 became occasional. My body was doing what bodies do when they're repaired and rested and given enough time. It was quietly, methodically getting on with it. My mind was less cooperative. I'd find myself in the middle of ordinary things, making coffee, reading, standing at the window watching the street, and the room would come back. Not as a memory exactly, more like a pressure at the edge of perception. The white walls that weren't quite white, the wooden chair, the figure with dark hair, the quality of stillness, the feeling of being accounted for. I'd push it away. I was good at pushing things away. Years of practice, but it kept returning, quietly, without urgency, the way water finds its level. It was Marta who started it, without knowing she was starting anything. She came for a weekend in early May. I was still on leave. The apartment was too clean in the way apartments get when someone with too much time is trying to feel useful. And on Saturday afternoon, while I was making lunch, she was sitting at the kitchen table with her tablet, and she said, without looking up, "Papa, have you ever heard of Carlo Acutis?" I didn't stop what I was doing. "No," I said. "He was a kid," she said, "in Milan. He died when he was 15. My friend's mother told her about him. He was really into computers, she said, and he was religious. Like, actually religious, not just going to church religious. I put a plate down. "Why are you telling me this?" She shrugged. The particular shrug of a 10-year-old who has a reason but isn't ready to give it. "Just thought it was interesting," she said. She went back to her tablet. I went back to the lunch. The name didn't land anywhere, didn't connect to anything. I filed it in the same place I filed most things Marta mentioned that I didn't know how to respond to. A place I told myself I'd return to and usually didn't. But that night, after she was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, and I typed the name into the search bar. Not because I expected anything, just because I was awake, and the apartment was quiet and I'd run out of other reasons to stare at a screen. The first photograph stopped me, not because I was certain, because I wasn't certain, and the uncertainty had a specific weight to it that I hadn't expected. Dark hair, slight build, a face that was composed in the way that some faces are composed without trying, without performing composure. Younger than I'd remembered maybe, or exactly as young as I'd remembered, and I'd been refusing to do the math. I sat with the photograph for a while. Then I read, born in London, raised in Milan, date October 2006, leukemia. 15 years old. I went back to the photograph, the hospital he'd been connected to, the parish, the neighborhood. I cross-referenced it against my own employment records in my head. The years overlapped. The geography overlapped. I read about the elderly neighbors he visited, about the way he moved through ordinary spaces, schools, streets, buildings, with an attention that people consistently described as unusual. Not pious, not performing anything, just present. Fully, uncomplicatedly present in a way that most people aren't and can't explain why. Are you alright? Not a question he'd asked because he was trained to ask it. Not pastoral reflex. Just a boy in a staff corridor on a Tuesday afternoon who looked at a man carrying a tool and saw something worth acknowledging. I closed the laptop, opened it again, read for another 2 hours. I want to tell you there was a moment of clarity, a clean before and after. That would be a more satisfying story. What there actually was, a slow, uncomfortable pressure, like something shifting in a foundation. Not collapse, adjustment. The kind of movement that makes old buildings groan at 3 a.m. for no visible reason. I thought about the room, the chair, the figure, the stillness. I thought about the 47-second mark on the clock above the boiler room door. The hesitation. The decision to keep going. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was frightened, because something that had been filed under nothing significant for 2 years had just quietly refused that categorization, and I didn't have another category ready. I called Marta on a Sunday morning. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake for a while, which meant she'd been reading. She was always reading on Sunday mornings, had been since she was 7. Papa, the name you mentioned, I said, Carlo Acutis. A pause. You looked him up, she said. Yes. And? I stood at the kitchen window. The street below was empty in the particular way of Sunday streets. Not abandoned, just resting. I think I met him, I said, once, at the hospital. Years ago. She was quiet for long enough that I checked the phone to see if the call had dropped. What was he like? She finally said. I thought about a boy reading a staff bulletin board with the attention of someone who found it genuinely worth reading. I thought about the question he'd asked me, direct, without agenda, the way children ask things before they learn that directness makes adults uncomfortable. He noticed things, I said. Marta didn't respond immediately. Then, Papa, are you okay? The same question, different voice, 10 years apart. I pressed my forehead lightly against the window glass. It was cold, specific and real and cold. I'm getting there, I said. It was the most honest thing I'd said in months. I told Dr. Sana about the room in our next session, all of it. The chair, the figure, the quality of stillness I'd never found adequate language for. The feeling of being accounted for by something that had no reason to know me. She listened the way she listened, like landscape. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How does it feel to say it out loud?" I considered that. Like admitting the northwest wing pipes need replacing, I said. Something I already knew. Just hadn't said. She almost smiled. "And what do you do?" she said. "Once you've admitted something needs replacing?" I looked at her. "You write the recommendation," I said, "even if nobody authorizes the repair." She nodded slowly. Said nothing else. That was, I think, the most useful thing therapy did for me. Not resolution, not answers, just permission to write the recommendation. To put on record that something was there even if I didn't know what to do with it. It's been 6 years. I have a defibrillator in my chest, a device the size of a deck of cards that monitors my heart's rhythm and has authority to restart it if necessary. It's done that once 2 years ago during a night when I was sleeping. I woke up not understanding what had happened, my chest feeling like someone had struck it from the inside. The cardiologist said it worked exactly as it should. I thanked her in the careful voice I use when I no longer know what to feel. I went back to work 18 months after the event, not to the same hospital. There was a careful conversation with Giorgio and HR that resulted in a transfer to a smaller facility on the other side of the city, a newer building, fewer legacy systems, less history in the walls. I didn't fight it. I understood the logic, both theirs and mine. Marta is 16 now. She's becoming someone with opinions and edges, and a particular quality of stillness when she's thinking that I recognize without knowing where from. She came to stay with me last summer for 3 full weeks. Not a weekend, 3 weeks. We managed it without either of us performing more than we needed to. We cooked together. We argued about a film. One evening, we sat on the balcony for 2 hours and talked about nothing specific, in the way that is sometimes the only honest way to talk about everything. I didn't tell her what I found in the room, what I felt. I told her the outline, that I had seen something, that it had stayed with me, that I wasn't sure what to do with it. She listened in the way she listens, which is completely. Then she said, "Does it need to be resolved?" And I didn't have an answer for that. What she seemed to think was probably fine. The anger is mostly gone. What replaced it isn't peace exactly. It's more like a different relationship to unresolved things. A tolerance for open questions that I didn't have before. I was trained, professionally and temperamentally, to trace a problem to its source, to find the fault, name it, fix it. The world made sense in that register. I was competent in it. I am less competent now in ways that have cost me something and also, I think, returned something I hadn't known was missing. I've read everything I could find about Carlo Acutis, the beatification, the testimonies, the accounts from people who knew him, teachers, friends, the neighbors he visited, the priest he was close to, all of whom describe, with variations, the same quality, an attention, a presence, the sense when he was in a room with you, that he was actually there in a way most people aren't. I've looked at the photographs more times than I can count. The dark hair, the slight build, the composure that doesn't look performed because it isn't. I cannot prove it was him. I also cannot, and I've tried. I've applied every skeptical instrument I have. I cannot make the alternative feel true. The timing, the geography, the way he looked at a stab bulletin board with the attention of someone who found it genuinely worth looking at. The question he asked without agenda, without preamble, the way children ask things before they learn that directness makes adults uncomfortable. Are you all right? I was not all right. I was 11 months from dying in the corridor of the building I'd maintained for a decade, and something in me knew it even when I refused to know it. I was a list with no end and nothing outside the list. I was a man who had outsourced his entire inner life to the physical logic of broken systems, and it felt like enough, and it was not enough. He saw that, or something saw it through him, wearing his face, and asked, "I don't know what I believe." I want to be honest about that because I've been offered beliefs by well-meaning people, by the church, by the literature, by the framework that would make this into a clean story about grace and intervention and transformation. I understand the appeal of that framework. I understand why it helps people and why it might be true. But I am still fundamentally a man who fixes pipes, who reads fault codes, who needs to know, if possible, what the mechanism is before he trusts the outcome. And the mechanism here is, I don't have it. What I have instead is the room, the chair, the figure, the stillness, the feeling of being accounted for by something that had no reason to know me and knew me completely. I have a second hand on a clock that hesitated at 47 seconds every morning for 3 weeks and then kept going. I have a defibrillator in my chest and a daughter who asks good questions and a transfer to a smaller hospital with fewer ghosts in the walls. I have a conversation in a staff corridor that lasted maybe 4 minutes with a boy who has been dead since 2006. I have the fact that he visited people who had no one. I have the fact that 2 years after he was gone, someone visited me. I still work in hospitals. The new facility has a boiler room on the sublevel, smaller than the old one. Cleaner, the kind of room that hasn't accumulated enough years to have character yet. There's a clock on the wall above the door. Digital this time. Red numerals on black. No second hand. I don't know why I notice clocks now. I've tried to stop noticing, and the noticing continues anyway, the way certain things do once you become aware of them. Clocks in waiting rooms. Clocks in corridors. The clock in the MRI suite that I spent 40 minutes staring at while a machine looked for something wrong inside me that turned out not to be there. Clock's measurement of the thing that is constantly leaving. The old hospital's boiler room clock, the one with the hesitating second hand, was replaced the year after I transferred. A new clock, digital, no hesitation. I know this because I asked Giorgio once in a brief exchange we had when our paths crossed at a facilities conference. He told me with the mild bewilderment of a man who had not expected anyone to care about that particular detail. I nodded, filed it. Marta called me last Tuesday. A regular call, no occasion. She'd been reading something. She's always reading something. And she wanted to tell me about it. We talked for 40 minutes. At the end, before she hung up, she said, "Papa, are you sleeping?" I told her I was. She said, "Okay," in the way that she says okay, with weight inside it. A door that isn't closed. After we hung up, I stood at the window for a while. The street below was doing what streets do in the early evening, shifting from the day version of itself to the night version, the light going lower and warmer, people moving through it at the pace of people who are going somewhere they chose to be. I thought about a boy in a staff corridor who visited people with no one. I thought about a room with white walls and a wooden chair. I thought about the feeling of being known completely, without judgment, without particular warmth, by something that had no reason to know me. I still don't have the word for it. I've stopped waiting for the word. There's a maintenance log open on my desk. 11 items on tomorrow's list. A pressure irregularity in the second floor bathrooms. A ground fault warning in the east panel. Intermittent, not critical. A smoke detector that I'm fairly sure is set for the wrong room size. Fixable things. Measurable things. Things that have a right answer if you look carefully enough. I'll go in at 7:15. I'll have the bad coffee from the break room machine. I'll work through the list, and at 47 seconds every minute for the rest of my life, I'll feel it. That small hesitation, and then the next second, and the next.